Welcome to Next Round with me, Dale McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. On today's episode, we're going to first of all dive into the escalating trade war between Canada and the US as both countries continue to ramp up tariffs. We'll explore the economic fallout of these decisions and what it means for businesses, consumers on both sides of the border. Impacting that, of course, then, we'll move on to a wider look at the US economy with a controversial decision to have a crypto reserve to alarming GDP forecasts from the Atlanta Fed. There's plenty to unpack here. And then finally, to round us out, we'll return back to this side of the world and shifting our focus to Ireland's housing market, where rent pressure zones have been a hot topic. David has authored an article this week talking about the impact of rent pressure zones and where to from now on them. So lots to unpack today. And if you do like this podcast, please like, share and subscribe to it. We're available on all major podcasting platforms and, of course, also available on YouTube, where you can watch us there and subscribe to our channel. David, it is good to see you this week.
Good to see you, Dale. Good to see you, Dale. Dale, the first thing I want to see and I want to do is can we show the hat?
I can show you the hat. So people will, of course, know the MAGA hat, the symbolic hat of the Trump campaign. Red, Make America Great Again. And in contrast and fighting back in this, of course, in the response to threats by the US president to annex and take over Canada, currently engaged in a trade war, Canadians are fighting back. And Canadians have their own hat, which I'm going to display now for viewers on YouTube. You can see it's a hat here that says Canada is not for sale. And I'm actually going to wear the hat, David, because I think as a Canadian citizen myself, I think it's important to show solidarity with my fellow Canadians who are the victims, I think, in this ongoing trade war. But it is, first of all, do you like the hat, actually? I think it's my first question.
I do. Yeah, I do. There's a number on the side of it as well, a year?
Yeah, 1867. So that's when Canada was basically started. Yeah, Confederation. Okay, yeah. The year of Confederation.
Canada would have first been a collection of different British,
correct,
kind of in the same way that the colonies in the US were separate. All the Canadas were separate, and then they kind of came together once the Americans had pushed the British back to theirs. Isn't that the rough kind of history of it?
That is basically it, David. Indeed, so 1867 is the year of Confederation of the Canadian provinces, and it is the distinction, of course, between Canada and the US. So, you know, this is I think this is a symbol, I think, of national the strongest national unity I've seen actually in quite a long time. And of course, this is in the face of escalating trade tensions between both Canada and the US. On the 4th of March, the US started by imposing a 25% tariff on most Canadian imports, excluding a planned 10% duty on energy products. Now, the move of this, of course, was aimed at addressing concerns over illegal immigration from Canada into the US, and also drug trafficking, with fentanyl being used as a reason to do that. Now, of course, in retaliation to this, Canada implemented its own 25% tariff on about $30 billion of US goods, with future plans to expand upwards to $125 billion over the course of the next 3 weeks. So this, as of course, has strained what has been a historically strong and close economic partnership. and is leading to broader market uncertainty and volatility, where and we'll talk about this later on in the wider US update, but significant declines in US stocks, and this unpredictability, I think, in US economic policy is leading to a real disruption in terms of growth for the country and overall economic stability.
Yeah, I can't believe we're talking about this. I mean, of all
He did
countries,
it. He did it.
he did it. Yeah.
Well, he did it. Well, he did it, and then he's rode back a little bit on it, actually.
But
So
this is the other part of it then, right? So you had 25% tariffs, and then they were delayed. First thing was to delay.
Yeah.
And then we've come along this week.
Well, they were in for a day. They were in for a day, I think, and then there was a delay.
And,
yeah.
I mean, does that mean any goods bought or sold on that day have to still be, someone's got a bill for, you're the unlucky guy who bought a car that day and got hit by the tariff because legally they're enforced then, or not. I don't know. I mean, you kind of revoke these things and then rewrite the past as to whether they were in place or not. The interesting thing, though, is how this week then we've seen Trump come along and basically say, okay, we're going to not do tariffs on any of the goods that are covered by the USMCA, which is the trade agreement. Previously NAFTA, now US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. That tells me that, okay, maybe we're going to have very little tariffs at all coming through. But the uncertainty is obscene, and it just doesn't make sense. You can see why it makes sense with Mexico, where there's cartels and fentanyl, which is genuinely in large numbers. But like, what have the Canadians done to piss off the Americans?
Well, and this is the question, because I think lots of people are wondering why is this happening? What is the angle? Now, the president is saying that this is down to fentanyl and trafficking issues. Now, the belief is he's saying that because that gives him special authorization to just use the presidential federal powers to implement these tariffs, because it's linked to a security concern. Yeah. What's worrying, though, David, and I've spoken to people quite senior on the Canadian federal government, and we've been joking for a while about he wants to annex the country, or he wants to. They're taking it extremely seriously. And what became quite frightening, actually, was when President Trump spoke to Prime Minister Trudeau this week. He is of the belief that the dividing line between both countries is actually no longer relevant. And he is potentially seeking to move what that dividing line could be. He's spoken about kicking Canada out of NORAD. And the idea, actually, one idea I've seen being referred to is that he might want to take control of the Great Lakes and move the line, because, of course, most of the Great Lakes, which covers significant fresh water for the US, is shared, controlled by Canada. The belief is that he wants to move control of that to be fully under US authority.
Right, and does that get the US a bit of extra fishing waters, or is it like fresh water for the water system? Or
yeah, I mean, he did mention before, of course, that Canada. This is in the context of the US of the fires in California, which devastated many parts of northern Los Angeles. That the Canadian tap actually controls a lot of the downward freshwater and lakes and rivers that can affect the drought situations in California. So the worrying thing here is, and I've seen a map here that could potentially want to redraw what that border looks like, and actually it brings all of Toronto into what would be the US.
Oh wow! Yeah,
which is. Yeah. I mean, this is crazy, this stuff.
Yeah, you'd end up with new lines everywhere. And then, because, I mean, if it is aggressively done, i.e., sorry guys, the line's here now, then does that involve military strength to go in and enforce that and treat a new region as being part of Canada? I mean, this could be quite messy. I mean, the question of why, though, it still comes up in my mind that the US, like, when you look at from a geopolitical lens, the US has an ocean each side of it. It's a continent with an ocean each side. They have the world's most powerful navy. The risk of invasion on the North American continent by any foreign power is incredibly low. And this is why countries tend to branch out and try and do land grabs, is to give themselves extra security. So the Russians have historically wanted to be in Ukraine and further down into Poland, because it plugs a gap that you eventually hit, where you hit, once you start to hit the kind of the Central European countries of Czech Republic and all, you start to hit mountain ranges, right? And then any invading army has to go through a much more narrow line that kind of runs through Germany to progress into the Russian space. So the reason the Russians historically always wanted to be in Eastern Europe and had the USSR was their perfect setup, the best they've ever had it, was that geopolitical security. So long as there's this crazy long border that runs through the Baltics, down Belarus, down Ukraine, all the way further down, that leaves the Russians vulnerable, and they feel it because they see the historical pattern. But the US doesn't have any of that. I mean, Trump is trying to behave as if he's a Russian czar with that kind of fear, but without actually a map to show that there's any risk to America from that point of view.
Yeah, so the New York Times reported this week that Trump told Trudeau that he did not believe that there's a treaty between both the US and then Great Britain, which covers the 49th parallel, which is the boundary between the US and the then Dominion of Canada. Where he suggests that it could easily be erased. He did not believe that the treaty that demarcates the border is valid anymore, and he wants to revisit that. And he offered, of course, no explanation as to why or background on that. And also, people might think that, oh, this is just Trump being Trump, but actually, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick told Canadian Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc that they'd come to the realization that the relationship between the US and Canada was governed by a slew of agreements that were fairly easy to abandon.
Yeah.
So this is rewriting and upending and every other type of description, the rule book and how we play and engage, not as adversaries but as allies or supposed allies.
The thing that's crossed my mind is, well, if Canada is the 51st state, does that, if it does eventually become that...
Not with this hat, David. It's not for sale.
I know, and I know this is quite extreme in the hypothetical, but maybe not too hypothetical. That Canada joining as one big state, well, that means that all the divisions within Canada would have to end, and that's all the provinces. But what I've seen said is that, well, you could have each individual province joining as each as individual states, right? But if that happened, look what would happen to something like the U.S. Senate. Every province would have 2 senators in the way that the U.S. states currently do, and you're going to have basically kind of Trudeau types tilting the balance in the U.S. Senate way towards a more liberal outlook, and in the House of Representatives, because there'd be similarly large numbers going into that. But that assumes that you end up with statehood on the same parallel as the others. The risk is you end up with something like Puerto Rico, where you're treated as kind of a second-class state. And that seems to be the terms upon which that Trump would like to bring Canada in.
Yeah, but I think the worrying point here, though, is, and of course we need to remember as well that 90. So of Canada's population, 90% of it lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border. So most of the land actually above north is uninhabited and not utilized. But again, that map that I saw where he wants to change the demarcation line, slightly moving it above north in Ontario means you'd take in all of the Greater Toronto Area, which is upwards of 10 million people, or a quarter of the population of the country, which is terrifying.
Yeah. And then you'd have the question of what would happen east of Toronto, which is into Quebec. So like of Canada's 40 million or so population, I was looking at this, Quebec is about 9 million. Yeah. So that's, basically 1 in 4 people are in that province. And it's a heavily French-speaking region. I think you've something like
75%, yeah.
speak every day, and there's a
Yeah.
further the remaining people will be fluent in it, and maybe just are English speakers. I was looking as well, Dale, at some of the provinces out to the east, then like your kind of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador. I think we've said
Yeah.
all three of those
Newfoundland. Yeah.
correctly.
Newfoundland,
Yeah,
Labrador.
so
Yeah.
out there it gets much more rural, and the population is much lower. Tends to be more English, but there's a bit of French out there too. You actually have two small islands that are actually owned by France still. Tiny islands, but they actually use the euro and all that kind of stuff. But it really makes me wonder then if there was to be something really aggressive that happens, do you end up with splits within Canada, i.e., that the French start to say, look, we're going to be really resolute on this. We are sticking to our French roots on this. We're not going to be bullied around with the US. And I'm sure Ontario and the rest would be of the same mind. But you could end up with actually a much more defined French part of Canada and a much more defined English side.
I can just say, I can give one guarantee. Again, I don't know where this is going to go. I have one guarantee to give you, David, and that is that I can guarantee you that Quebec will never, ever in our lifetime join the US under any way, shape, or form. The reason why is that Quebec, and I've said this before, haven't even signed the Canadian Constitution. so, so we barely have them in Canada. So
yeah.
it's But I think then, David, kind of just zooming out a little bit here and maybe looking more towards, the wider disruption that this is causing to the US as well. And we've seen well, first of all, the markets this week have been a disaster. Significant declines in major US indices, S&P, Dow, etc., all red, all significantly down this week. But we've seen other elements which are quite left of field, such as the executive order to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which is aimed to position the US as a leader in the cryptocurrency space. And of course, this has further exacerbated concerns by the market around potential conflicts of interest within the administration and setting up such a reserve, and then also separately the Atlanta Fed adjusted its estimate for the first quarter, and it's predicting a contraction of 2.4% for this quarter, which is of course significant.
Yeah. Let's do the crypto stuff first because it's
crypto bros or whatever.
It's so like countries could build up reserves of things that have strategic long-term use. And if you build up if you're the Saudis and you build up reserve of oil, and the US has oil reserves and all that, or you can have gold reserves and that. Crypto, if you were to do just Bitcoin, right, which has begun to take on some use as being kind of like a digital gold, is what people describe it as being. But what the US have done is they have announced that there will be 5 different types of cryptocurrencies in that reserve fund. Bitcoin, Ethereum, Cardano, Solana, and Ripple. I think I may have misquoted one of those, but those so happen to be.
No, you're right. Those are the 5.
Those are the 5, and those so happen to be the top 5 holdings of the crypto czar himself, the guy who is setting up his firm, who was Crypto Investments, is heavily invested in top 5 and in those 5. Like it screams to high heavens. Like, I did a master's in financial regulation, and like this is like just alarm bells going off in my head about how you absolutely should not have conflicts of interest like that. And it is also about government picking winners. So what happened when the European Union announced that the USB-C cable would be the de facto default cable for all devices across the EU? You had Americans, exactly the type of people who are probably lacking for this kind of stuff now. They were saying, "Oh, well, you're picking winners. What about the Apple cable? You're basically locking that in, and you're saying, well, there can never be a cable better than the USB-C.
You're defining it as a success piece, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And now look what they've just done with this Bitcoin reserve. You're basically saying those 5 are the top 5, and they're always going to be the top 5. So we're never going to have better cryptocurrencies emerge, even though Ripple and Solana, which actually they have faster transaction speeds than Bitcoin, those emerged in more recent times as being an innovation building on
Now,
top of the
David,
others
why would someone do that?
because they have a conflict of interest. And this
Exactly.
is the problem with some of the things we're seeing from this US administration.
And the
They're
market
because
doesn't like it.
no, the market doesn't like it. And look, this comes back to what Trump is trying to do with Project 2025, driven by that Heritage Foundation policy.
Yeah.
They had a list of loyalists going into this administration, a list of people that they knew they could trust, and that has brought with it problems. And look, every administration goes in with a list of people that they would like in positions, but the problem with the Trumpian approach is that it's putting yes men in place, people who have rubbed Trump's ego enough to be in high position, and that is a long-term negative for quality of your democracy, your institutions, for quality of governance. And that crypto thing for me is just like it's a signal of why you should be worried about how the US is as a country for 4 years from now. And there could be a recession in the near term, so that ain't good either.
Well, I mean, on the recession piece as well. I mean, so as we mentioned, the Atlanta Fed has revised its model, which is now showing a contraction of 2.4% of real GDP growth for the first quarter of this year, David, which of course is alarming considering the performance of the U.S. economy over the last number of years has been significantly strong and growing in a stable and very. I think many people invested in the stock market doing very well. I've been very happy. Inflation, of course, has always been the piece which has been their challenge, but broadly things going fairly well. We're now into contraction mode.
Yeah, potentially, and the reason, so that Atlanta Fed, it's a forecast of a mix of different variables, right? So you'll be looking in at things like the jobs numbers, right? So job hirings are data points that we get sometimes pretty much every week actually in the US, and they have an estimate for them. And if you're above estimate, that'll send that number higher. If you come in below estimate, below what other economists expect, that'll send the number lower too. But a big reason why we're seeing this downward revision, and this is just forecast, it might not happen, but part of it is that government is beginning to shut down in parts of the US, driven by Doge and the cutbacks that have been happening, just freezing of funding, right? We're actually seeing today in Ireland now announcement of job cuts by Concern, the charity that does work with USAID. And because the USAID money dries up, that leads to job losses here in Dublin. But because there's such a broad hit to the US government by freezing funding, GDP is an equation that includes government. So it's government plus investment plus private consumption and then trade, imports minus exports. Anyone who did Leaving Cert economics would have come across that equation, or even intro economics if you did it in college. When you take government down a notch, so suddenly you will have a reverberation into the rest of the economy, because one group of workers slows down their spending. A whole bunch of contracts have been halted, and that's actually private sector companies that are dealing with the government, so their order book dries up, and then you have this reverberation. Those people then don't have the money to go out and spend as much in the economy, and you can end up with a slowdown. So this could be an unusual one, and that could be a kind of a government induced recession.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is no, and of course Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has said that there will be in defense of this, there's a temporary adjustment period, I think is what he said, that while we get used to the changes being made to the to US spending. But end of the day, I mean, I think, if President Trump is ending his first quarter in a recession, that's not a great start for the presidency.
No, and his approvals have already tipped from a kind of a moderate approval towards pretty much halfway, and that's been heavily driven by younger voters who have massively upped their disapproval for Trump. Now, the other thing about this government thing is what Lutnick has been saying about how they report GDP. So in the Biden years,
that's right, yeah,
the Trumpers were skeptical of the GDP numbers because you had rising government investment because of things like the IRA. Now that was they were tax credits, but that kind of worked through the government side of the equation. And they were saying, look, if you're hiring people, that's just fake job numbers. It's not real work, right? And they argue now that they're cutting that stuff. Oh yeah, that could be a hit to GDP, but we want to report things differently. We want to tell you just what the private sector is doing. So we want to have a measure that will be X government. Now, mathematically, you could do that, right? But then you're back to the problem that I just mentioned, which is that when you cut government spending quite suddenly, you're going to have a kind of a blast radius into the private economy. So that private number should also slow. So you might have the Trump administration coming out and doing this. They'll produce two different numbers of GDP, and actually both of them might be falling.
Yeah. So it's I mean, like you'd think as well. Like again, what's the end game here, David? Like I know because I think the one thing I think we're finding with this administration is where are they going, or what's the longer term play? That is actually not certain, and of course, this is also why I think markets are not liking what they're seeing here because they don't know the longer term play. What's the game here, do you think?
Well, the game has always been, and this is important to look back at what Lutnick and Trump and others have been saying, is that it is about an economic nationalism. It's about getting jobs back into America. So you do your tariffs to try and dissuade foreign trade, which means you get more investment back home.
The carrot, of course, that they're putting in front of people is that more tariffs means less income tax than for U.S. citizens.
Yeah, and like the evidence base for that is really, really frail.
Totally.
And the likes of the Heritage Foundation, who I mentioned, there were authors from that organization who back in the first Trump term were saying tariffs never work or stuff like that. And then you have these articles there's an article this week that was pulled from their website. And then the guy who wrote that article is now out saying, "Oh no, the tariffs are great, and the tariffs are going to have upsides and this kind of stuff." And it's people losing their principles and their willingness to actually be grounded in evidence in their economics, actually just turning towards the current regime and just kind of going along with the idea because Trump's leading it. That's the problem with this.
And David, is there a concern here? Was one of the worries, not worries, is one of the reflections that I'm having, which is kind of a worry as well, is the way the US are engaging in diplomacy now going forward and their economic engagement with former partners now is a good way to describe them. This abrasiveness is just really going to piss people off. And like for example, take Canada, right? I saw David Frum tweeted recently that it takes a special kind of person to F up the Canadian-US relationship this badly. Where you have people now who are willing to just no longer want to buy cheaper US goods. They are willing to buy more expensive domestic goods to fight back against this. Are we going to see just a total moving away from focus and support from the US by the likes of Canada, EU countries, the Anglosphere, to now and maybe looking more eastward? Do we start to think about, do we need to re-engage China in certain ways?
Yeah, so the thing about buying Canadian or buying your local goods, consumers do move on from a kind of an acute political moment like this. If you want to buy cheap goods, you'll buy them typically, from wherever they're cheapest. That may mean that people still go back to buy some American goods in Canada, right? But the bigger thing, as you mentioned, is the geopolitics. It's the idea of, well, the reason we've had a kind of global system that has been somewhat reciprocal on many issues is the idea that, well, every country needs something now, but then may need to help out another country in future and help out their problem. And that you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But the US is now basically saying, well, we only want our back to be scratched, and we're not really going to approach global affairs with the need to scratch others. But the time may come where the US needs to draw on others for help. After 9/11, the NATO clause was invoked, and you had many allied countries rowing in behind activities.
The only time it was invoked as well, isn't that right?
Yeah. And then you have, Vance going off and saying, "Oh well, there's there's armies out there now that have very very little capability, and that aren't really up to the fight. And it's like, well, the British and French, not just the French, but the British fought us alongside America in Afghanistan and Iraq, and there was over 600 coffins that came back to Britain because of those wars. So the idea that you can just treat your allies like that, but then expect a future war to be something that Brits or others would stand up and align with the US on, that those days are over. And the US is really taking a bet that they're not going to have a major conflict to intervene on, and one that they would want to pull in other countries for. But take, for example, if something like Taiwan happened, that China would invade Taiwan. The US, you might think, would, well, I don't know what people would think now. All sort of prior assumptions are out the window now. But there's two options. One is the US intervenes because they realize that this is across a major trade lane that would be interfered with. There's major US Navy activity in the area. Or the US would say, you know what, that's China's backyard, let them have it. Because they also now seem to believe, well, Russia's backyard, let them have Ukraine. Therefore, everyone looks after their own backyard and we don't care about the rest of the world. But if the US did want to intervene, would it do it alone? Would it not want to call in the support of other European allies, other countries that have navies, thinking of Brits again? But are they going to get any sort of support for that now? I mean, those days seem to be behind us. At least that's the bet that the US is making.
All bets are off, and the rules are being rewritten, I think, in front of us in terms of how these countries and allies are going to engage further. We're seeing now, of course, rearm Europe and a huge increase in spend by European countries on defense capabilities because Europe is now viewing itself as increasingly alone.
Yeah, it is. That's a good, I think, like, for Europe, that's going to be long-term positive. We needed to ultimately
this is the thing. I actually agree with you totally. I think like we must look for positives in some of these stories, and I think one of them is that actually there's a fire been lit underneath the EU's behind, I think, and taking control of their own determination, I think, is an important thing, because there is, it's not black or white. There is some truth in what President Trump has been saying before about how the European countries did not invest and were offenders in terms of the NATO requirements. And now I think that needs to change, and that's probably a net positive.
Yeah, you now have the Polish talking about potentially getting nuclear weapons. You've got,
and then that goes to the other extreme then, which is, well, do we need more countries with more nuclear weapons? Do we need net new holders of nuclear weapons and armaments? I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for global affairs.
It's a shame that we came through the kind of the post-war era when both the US and Russia destroyed a lot of their nuclear weapons. They took down the numbers on each side, and that was a net good for. I mean, each of them still had dozens or hundreds of them, but it meant that they weren't going to have the capability to blow each other fully off the face of the map. Now, of course, even one nuclear weapon, if detonated, can do extreme damage.
Well, one modern nuke is about 1,000 times as powerful as the nuclear bomb that hit Nagasaki and Hiroshima in World War II. Even if one goes off, that's it.
So then you might argue that the total number doesn't really move the dial much, but it does move the dial if more countries have them. And actually, Poland getting one is quite important because they're going to need that to turn against Russia. I mean, they border right up to Belarus, and what happened with troops going into Belarus, then down into Ukraine to start that offensive back in 2022. Why wouldn't the Russians repeat the same rule book? They're probably going to go for the Baltics first, so maybe we need a nuke each in those countries. But Poland, they feel that next in line problem, and they are part of that geopolitical gap that I mentioned. When you start to hit the mountain ranges, and Russia gets their security. And look, the old Iron Curtain used to run right into East Germany. So they see now in their historical pattern of just getting steamrolled. So
I know we do want to move topic in a second, but perhaps this is one thing to explore maybe more in our next episode. But my feeling, David, is that I feel we're slowly sleepwalking into some kind of major conflict. every major actor and player on the world stage seems to be, for me, it has a feeling that we're moving into something quite negative and dark. And I think all it takes is one side to make a mistake, be overly aggressive, and we enter a different phase of the modern world, I think.
I think that risk is out there. I do actually think in the near term, maybe not. I think we go through a phase of this being a tense moment, a rearmament moment, and then we probably have a settling period where we're like, oh, okay, well, Russia didn't go much further. Maybe they didn't go into those other countries, and then everyone ups their defense, but you don't end up with something just yet. I think that could be more the way it goes. But then all hell could just break loose thereafter. There's no
Yeah.
way of closing that off. There really isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears with the remaining time, David, and we want to bring us back to Ireland. And you had an article recently in the Irish Independent which spoke about rent pressure zones and the effect of rent pressure zones. But now is the time to phase them out to encourage further investment, increasing housing supply, etc. So, David, why don't you give us a quick overview of what was your argument?
Yeah, so I was writing this because the rent pressure zones topic has come back into light this year.
Mm-hmm.
There's now talk that we're going to end the rent pressure zones and move to a system of reference rents. Reference rents were recommended by the Housing Commission, although not all members. There were 3 members of the Housing Commission that wrote a minority report where they argued that, look, all rent controls are bad. So I wrote an article basically in support of that.
What are reference controls or reference rents?
Right. So the idea with a reference rent is in a given area, let's pick Dublin 2.
Yeah.
And within Dublin 2, if you've got 2-bed apartment and you're setting your rent for that, you can only set a rent that is similar-ish to other Dublin 2 2-bed apartments, if that makes sense. So you have to kind of set your rent.
So it's market-led, market-controlled almost by what others are doing.
You mean a control on the market, like a
not an actual control, but it allows everyone to kind of increase in a stable, considered way. If that makes sense.
In theory, that is how it works.
Yeah.
The problem with it is if you're only referencing against other rents, what kind of space do you get to increase, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I mention increases, when people talk about increasing rents, you can come across as a very kind of, oh, that's very pro-landlord. But there does come a point where you rent control a market too strongly, and then a decade later, wages have risen by a ton, and then you basically drive landlords out of the market entirely. And
which is what's been happening.
Yeah. So you want to walk a fine line where you encourage new supply to come onto the market, but you also give some protection to renters. So the idea of reference rents is to try and do that. There's no clarity yet on whether the reference rents are going to allow 2% increases, 5%, 10%. Like how far above the reference are you allowed to go? And is it in a given year? Is it over 2 or 3 years or whatever, right? So we're actually now in a period of uncertainty again in the whole rental system. We've come through a year where we had a 24% drop in apartment completions.
Mm-hmm.
And most apartments now are to rent, so that's where your new rental supply tends to come through. And that's basically flatlined now. And that was partly driven by higher interest rates. But the rent pressure zones have really put a dampener on that sector. Now, the rent pressure zones made sense in an economy where we used to have a 4% rent cap each year, but wages were far less than that. You'd wage growth some years of just 1 or 2%. And I mean the pre-COVID years, that's when we had a 4% cap.
Mm-hmm.
We now have a cap that is 2%, but it's actually a bit lower because of whatever CPI is, that's what the cap is. So CPI at one stage late last year was 1%. So you'd end up with just 1% rent increases being allowed in any given year. But Dale, what did wages do during that time? Well, we had wage growth of over 5% just last year. So we've entered a very different economy where the pace of wage growth is much higher, but the rent cap is still very strict. And my view, at the very least, would be to allow higher, much less strict cap, go back to 4% or allow something a little higher. The system of reference rents, I think, is going to be a bureaucratic nightmare. It's probably going to take us years to get it going. Other countries like Germany has it in some regions, I believe. But you can suffer from a lack of data. So if you're in a rural area and there's only 2 or 3 other properties and they're all terrible, they're all like really dilapidated, and you come along,
sample size is small,
and if you come along and make an A-rated property and you really do up your place because you want to deliver something good into that rental market, but your reference rents is against these crappy places, well then you're not going to be able to charge a rent that is commensurate with the money you've invested in.
And the reality then is that'll actually prevent that development from happening, full stop.
Yeah, exactly. And it's in rural areas that we have a big crying out for more rentals.
And these caps, rent controls, again, you referenced, David, the 25% drop in completions for apartments. So what we've seen has been, the dampening of new developments, primarily in the apartment sector as well over the last most recent time in Ireland, but in particular in Dublin as well. One model, David, and I've referenced this before, and I think I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, which is, what if you were to introduce rent controls, but for older buildings? So, and the reason I say this is to give investors and developers, license and certainty on their returns, on their properties, that, let's say, homes completed, I don't know, let's say from 2021 onwards, they are exempt from rent controls. But everything before that is allowable for rent controls. And again, it gives you that certainty, and it splits the market. And I know it's not perfect, and I know there's problems, but to me, that makes more sense if you want to keep the private sector active and alive.
I like that idea, and what I would do it is not so much by age. You can have properties that are 100 years old and are pristine on the inside. I would do it by the BER energy rating. So
true.
You have a major problem with the private housing stock, that it tends to be a lot of D, E, F, G kind of rated properties amongst it, and any of the A or B stuff is new stuff that was built more recently. So what you could do is that you would rent control properties that are older. So you actually give an incentive to landlords there. You want to see, it's like you want to charge higher rents. Well, you gotta start.
I like that idea, David.
Get insulation done, right? So you steer the incentives towards that. But then any new investment coming through your A and Bs, that doesn't have as strict or even any rent controls. But that means that people are going to want to get into that market. You're going to want to build a brand new apartment block because you know that you can charge the market rate. And the market rate, if there's a slowdown in the economy, you're like we talked earlier about Trump, your market rate is going to be lower than you expect. And it could take you much longer to get a return on your investment. Like, the idea, people treat rental markets as being, if you don't have rent controls, it's always going to be a landlord's market, and it's always going to benefit landlords. It's always going to be crap for renters. That's never always the case. You have different phases of our economies, different phases of Ireland's history, where that isn't always the case. And what you want is to allow investors to go into the market that are going to be willing to be there for decades, into the long term, to weather out the good and the bad.
Yeah. Now, just zooming out on this a little bit, of course, this is the problem on this, is that, we're how many years into a rental crisis now, David? Really, a decade into this. Yeah. We tried out rent pressure zones for a number of years, now realizing that actually they weren't really that good. We're kind of yo-yoing on our policy.
It's too much, and I accept that by calling for the end of rent controls, that is a policy change, right?
Yes.
You're in that world of, if we were to, have a report out first, the way these things go through policy, you'd have a report first. So should we get rid of them? What would the impact of them being gone? And then you lose a year because people think that they might actually stay, or people might start to pre-invest because they think they might be lifted. And then you have to change of them. Yeah, like the whole rental and the broader housing system has been plagued by this kind of re-regulation problem, where we just keep adding new stuff. And now we have a new planning bill, but that might take 1 or 2 more years to actually be fully functional.
Oh yeah, it has to be activated. There's lots of changes happening, and then we won't see the impact of that for a couple of years thereafter. So yeah,
Yeah, and then you have additional ideas that are coming through, like the idea by Progress Ireland of having kind of cabins at the back of your house. Now that's kind of maybe its own separate thing, but like and that would be good, I think, if it happened. But like you need to go through another round of planning legislation to make it happen. So you just
Yeah.
end up with a whole more round of different changes and what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So yeah, there's no easy things with this housing stuff. Could you have picked 10 years ago a policy to set that would have steered you through the whole housing crisis in an optimal way, such that we would have ended the housing crisis by now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like
And,
David, you referenced the GDP equation, and how it was one of the first things one learns in Economics 101. And one of the things I first learned in my Economics 101 class when I was studying was how rent controls have never worked wherever they've been implemented.
yeah,
And
yeah,
this is, I think we're coming to that conclusion again, that once again, they have not worked. And it's
yeah,
supply.
yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
On that note, we are out of time, so I think, David, we'll leave it there. So thanks to everyone for listening and watching. Again, if you did like this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. We're available on all major podcasting platforms, also available on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to our channel there. That's all we have for this week. We'll see you again soon. Take care, and bye-bye.